I'm gonna look at connections from the perspective of mental health. But I would like to start off by introducing connections as a basic psychological need. Actually, one of the most prominent models of psychology that has to do with our motivation to do things says that we have three main psychological needs. The first one is autonomy, being able to be authentic, connecting with others in a way that really and truly represents what we are, who we are. The second one is competence, actually unleashing our potential. And the third one is relatedness, which would be connections, our ability to connect. And one of the most complex and challenging goals of us human beings, for some it's even the most important one, is our ability to form and sustain relationships. So this is a bit beyond a need. It's actually who we are as human beings. And mental fitness is actually fostered by our ability to connect. So this is our brain, and there are many models which try to decipher how our brain is working, but one of them is quite a simple one, dividing it into two parts, the conscious and the unconscious. The conscious is rigid and rational, whilst the unconscious is automatic and mostly emotional. We may like to perceive ourselves as rational, but I can assure you that we are much more emotional than we are rational. Our emotional system is processing whatever is happening, whether we want it or not, whether we put an effort or not, and it's also working when we're sleeping. It's like an overprotective mother trying to make sure that we're safe. And therefore, the two systems have different ways of connecting. Actually, our conscious is quite limited, but the potential of our unconscious is infinite. Now that we've understood that the way we connect is really important to us, we can understand the impact of mental health problems and the hidden disability that people with severe mental health problems have to put up with. This tends to happen in depression. In depression, everything slows down. People tend to communicate less. People tend to process things consciously at a much slower rate. So their ability to connect is quite limited. And then when we have the opposite, when someone is too processing things at a much faster rate than usual. And this is when someone has hypomania or mania. The experience of being manic is usually described as having racing thoughts. So inability to actually think and connect in a way that is logical and in a way that can be sustained. And therefore people in a manic state tend to try to connect, try to process too many things at the same time. And this turns out to be not very efficient. Then we have other forms of mental illness that tend to hinder connections. And this is one of them is social phobia, when people really do not feel comfortable when they have to connect or when they are at the center of attention. They usually experience a lot of anxiety, and this anxiety tends to hinder our ability to think, our ability to concentrate, problem solve, plan, and therefore connections are limited. One of the most devastating conditions in mental health is schizophrenia, to the extent that there are many hypotheses which try to understand what's going on in schizophrenia, but actually one interesting one is this disconnection hypothesis, when parts of the brain are no longer connected and as they should, and therefore the information processing will end up, is mumbled up, and people start to do things that are either inappropriate or very socially that cannot sustain important connections. People, when we think about schizophrenia, we think about delusions, we think about hallucinations, but actually the most devastating disability of schizophrenia is in the social domain. People cannot function socially as they could before they experienced the condition. Now I'm shifting to more enduring conditions that reflect problems with strategies that we tend to use too much. And I'm talking about personality problems, personality traits. And one of them is, this is paranoid personality, when the person's ability to connect in a way that there is trust. Trust is a very important ingredient in relationships. And if the person cannot or is completely afraid of trusting anyone, then connections are very, very limited. Another one is this schizoid personality, where people with this kind of personality feel that they do not need to connect, and they prefer actually to be alone with limited connections. Then there is the dissocial personality, the personality of those who believe that they can violate other people's rights, and actually this is not going to help them to make sustained connections. Then there are those who need a lot of attention. They have an excessive need for connections that other people cannot sustain. And this would be the borderline personality disorder. The borderline personality disorder is usually the result of very few connections when the person is growing up. So there is limited opportunity for emotional and cognitive development. And people with this kind of personality would do anything to connect, to the extent that they overload other persons, and their connections therefore are not healthy. Then there is the anxious and ambivalent, anxious avoidant personality, which is much more severe than a normal anxiety disorder. People who are anxious all the time and they are fearful of how they are perceived by others. And when we are anxious, the most common strategy is to avoid. And people who have this sort of anxiety, they avoid relationships because they are afraid that something would go wrong. This is another common one, the narcissistic personality. People with narcissistic personality, their main disability is they cannot empathize. And if they cannot empathize, they cannot connect with other people to the extent that they can at least experience in their imagination what the other person how the other person is feeling. And then we have another enduring condition which is beyond personality now. This is a condition that affects our neurological development, so it's there from the word go. And I'm talking about autism. The main disability in autism is in the social domain. This is not episodic. This is people with autism are quite rigid, and they have, depending on the severity, their level of connections is very rudimentary. And people like ourselves, who I'd like to think myself, who is able to connect, we cannot assume that this ability is going to stay with us forever. So people with dementia, people who develop brain failure, will lose their ability to connect because the different functions of the brain start to fail. And I'm sure you came across people who have dementia, and you can see the conspicuous change in their ability to relate with other people. And in extreme conditions, they become unable to recognize their close relatives. And at the very severe end, there is what we call the mirror sign. They are not even able to connect with themselves. They can't recognize themselves in the mirror. And this is where my interest is, when we develop a connection with a substance or with a behavior that we do repetitively, despite the fact that we're fully aware that it's causing us some form of harm. I'm talking about addiction. There are many conceptualizations of what addiction could be. Nobody seems to agree on what addiction is. But my hunch is that we are not agreeing on what addiction is because addiction has to be understood at the level of the individual. Addiction is a manifestation of individual experiences. And one of the definitions of addictions that I tend to subscribe to is when someone develops an excessive motivation to engage in some sort of behavior which has to cause some form of harm. So despite the harm, the connection with the behavior is excessive, to the extent that at some point the person has to decide, has to choose either proceeding with this form of connection or all the other connections that the person had in his or her life. Why? Because this connection with the behavior or the substance with time takes maximum priority, and the person has to leave behind all the other connections. So this is what I had to say about connections from the perspective of mental health. I hope that most of the stuff was clear enough. Thank you.